Finally, seventh specific form that we should look at in detail is the execution protocol itself, the way that when people are ultimately put to death, the administration is organized and implemented. So in these rare cases where the sentence is actually carried out, executions are, and this is in huge contrast to the historical use of death penalty, executions are low visibility events, hidden from the public, usually in a special death chamber deep in a state prison. The modern execution is carefully arranged to ensure the minimum possible physical suffering, a kind of 0 degree of explicit violence. Any visible signs of pain are regarded as a failure. Indeed, today, the possibility of invisible pain, as it were below the paralyzed, immobile surface of the person's body, these are regarded as unacceptable in the American context. Instead of torture and bodily torments, there is medical solicitude and sedation. The event itself is organized not as a public ceremony as in the old days, but instead as a bureaucratically managed procedure emphasizing speed and no-nonsense efficiency. The idea is to get the job done, to make it uneventful as possible. In that sense, it's what you might describe as anti-theatrical. It lacks much in the way of ritual or ceremonial or even deliberate symbolism. Communication is suppressed. Photographs are prohibited for reasons that we probably saw with the cell phone photographs of Saddam Hussein. Photographs are prohibited because they're so much desired by the viewing public. But we want to prohibit that viewing. We want to minimize the spectacle. So photographs are prohibited. The event is minimally reported, unless, of course, something goes wrong, in which case the negative publicity that ensues kind of escapes the control of the authorities and they lose the narrative. But when they're in control, the execution is minimally reported. It's merely a kind of judicial event that has to be made to happen but not represented. In the physical process of killing, the authorities seek to avoid any spectacle, but to the extent that some display is inevitable, they aim to display restraint rather than excess, bureaucratic efficiency rather than unseemly violence. So, how should we begin to think about these peculiar forms and characteristics? How do we make sense? How do we interpret them? As I mentioned at the beginning, sociologists have yet to produce a really detailed, grounded account of modern capital punishments. But in the absence of anything better, the account that's repeatedly invoked is that of Michel Foucault. So I want to begin by discussing rather briefly the Foucauldian interpretation and then applying it to, or showing how it can't be applied to, the American contemporary context. Here's a question. How many of you have read the first 4 or 5 pages of Discipline and Punish? Hands up. Okay, that's helpful. So in his famous account of the execution of Robert Damien in 1757, which is the rather spectacular story that begins the Discipline and Punish book, Michel Foucault offers us a powerful model of capital punishment, a kind of archetypal image that has shaped much thinking ever since. What he does, to summarize a rather complex story, is he theorizes capital punishment as a ritual of sovereign state power. He says that capital punishment is a public ceremony in which state actors, in this case Louis XV, utilize spectacular violence and the offender's body to display the force and the majesty of state power. In other words, it's a kind of shock and awe campaign on the scaffold to reveal how very powerful the state behind the punishment is. Capital punishment is a means whereby the sovereign state seeks to create submission, obedience, and social order. It's a kind of exemplary act of rule that asserts the state's monopoly over violence. Foucault says this. He says, the public execution is to be understood not only as a judicial but also as a public ritual. I beg your pardon, as a political ritual. It belongs, he says, even in minor cases, to the ceremonies whereby power is manifested. He goes on, the public execution has a juridico-political function. It's a ceremonial whereby a momentarily injured sovereign is reconstituted. Now we should note that for Foucault, the sovereign state is the principal and really the only actor in this scene. It's the unmoved mover. It's been provoked by the insult of the criminal's offense, but the state obeys no one outside of itself. It follows that the people, the crowd, the masses, the mob, the citizens, have merely an auxiliary kind of walk-on part in this drama. They're merely onlookers and consumers. They may be supporters, but they're in no way essential. Foucault says this explicitly. He says, the vengeance of the people was called upon to become an unobtrusive part of the vengeance of the sovereign. Not that it was in any way fundamental, or that the king had to express the people's revenge. It was rather that the people had to bring assistance to the king. So it's all about the sovereign, all about the sovereign state. The people are merely the onlookers. They have no other role. They're to be impressed. They're to be supportive. They have no decision-making power. Now, of course, Foucault wasn't talking about modern American capital punishment, and he didn't ever discuss modern American capital punishment. But France, where he was writing, he published his book in 1975. It was translated in 1977. France continued to decapitate offenders in the yards of its prisons up until 1977, didn't abolish the death penalty until 1981. So Foucault, as a political activist and an intellectual, had many opportunities to comment on and think about the death penalty in its modern, late 20th century form. And he does this. He discusses in Discipline and Punish the history of sexuality in a variety of interviews. He talks about how it changed over time in modern France and how it moved from the scaffold where Robert Damien was pulled apart to the modern guillotine where 1977 executions occurred. As we will see, the descriptive things that Foucault said, his kind of observations about how it looked, they fit very well with the American system. But his theory of what it's about, his theoretical insistence on seeing capital punishment as an act of state sovereignty, seems to me not to work very well in the American context. Let me say a little about his descriptive account first. He says, in the 20th century, there's a shift from the imposition of death to the deprivation of life. Not the same thing exactly. What he means is that there's a shift away from a painful, atrocious death to a simple extinguishment of life. The idea is not to torture the person to death to enjoy his dying. The idea is merely to terminate his license to live. He says, the guillotine is the instrument that takes life almost without touching the body. Now, when you think about it, that's a rather French perception. I think an Anglo-American look at the guillotine would notice that heads roll and blood spurts. But his point is that the idea wasn't to inflict torture or to injure or bruise the body. The idea was merely to finish the life instantly. And of course, the lethal injection that's developed in America is the epitome of what he's describing. He emphasizes what he calls judicial reticence and the avoidance of pain as part of the modern death penalty. He says, when the moment of execution approaches, the patients, notice the terminology, the patients are injected with tranquilizers, a kind of utopia of judicial reticence, take away life, but prevent the patient from feeling it. Again, very descriptive of the American system that evolved. Finally, he says there's a shift from spectacle. The laws of gravity are working themselves out with this microphone before me, yes. He says there's a shift from the spectacle to the secret procedure. He says the modern rituals of execution attest to a double process, the disappearance of the spectacle and the elimination of